I began to think about this and also think about the fact that the kids were in here with us as well, and I struggled really putting a title on this in this fashion, More Than Kings, on whether that was the correct way to title this or not. And I really didn't want to necessarily go through the whole book of Esther, but I want us to look at something, and it's going to use not only that story, but other stories that come from the Scripture that hopefully will show us that there's something more important than just being the guy in charge or the woman in charge. There's something that God has given his people, whether it be the time that he was working with Israel and Judah, whether it be the time that he was bringing about the coming of the Messiah, the coming of the Savior to that time, and working with those people, or whether it be working with those who are children of his through the Messiah, through Jesus himself, that God has given us something that has made us more than kings. Now, if we're go back and read Esther, I mean, the things that we would see within Esther, I mean, it's just simply amazing, because you come, first of all, introduced to what happens in the realm of kings. Whether it is, maybe you're using the King James or New American Standard and you see the name of the king as Ahasuerus, or maybe you're using the NIV, which translates it Xerxes. And there's some difference of opinion whether it was Xerxes or, as the Greek Septuagint in their translation used Artaxerxes. And so that would be a little bit later on. But dating this exactly, we have Ahasuerus as it comes across from the Hebrew writing. The king who is over the entire area. If you will, he was more than a king even himself. He was more like an emperor, having now been made king or reigning as king over all of the Persian Empire. And having a party, more or less, in the palace. He wants his wife to come and dance, and she refuses to come and dance. They're all drunk, and she refuses to come and dance, and he says, "No more with you, Queen Vashti. I'm going to find a new queen." And so it's almost as if they hold a beauty pageant, but as we see all of this happening within the palace, and the king simply doing whatever the king wants to do. Here's Mordecai, a completely unknown Jewish man. He has raised, because she's now grown, Esther. And he has raised her because her parents are no longer alive, and he has raised her. He's an older cousin. A lot of times I think we kind of think of Mordecai as an uncle, but it says he's a cousin. So he was older. I mean, they must have had a family somewhat like ours, I guess. But yeah, those who know are laughing. But here a cousin is raising this young girl, and he must have done a good job. She listens to the things that he says. I mean, he has guidance that is there, and you can see this loving guidance, but there's something that seems to be weighing even more important than that, something that goes deeper. And it's amazing, because as we see this story start to unfold, and you read through all of Esther, as we have it in the Scripture today, God is not mentioned. Not directly. God is not mentioned within this book. Now, there are some references, there's some things that Mordecai is going to say that would make us think, okay, he's talking about God, and I think truthfully, he is talking about God, but he doesn't say that. Not per se. But he tells Esther, he says, you need to go. And so he takes her, and there's this period of time in which they are prepped, and they are groomed, and they are trained, and they're going to be presented to the king. And guess what? Out of all of these young ladies that come from this great empire of Persia, here is Esther. And she's chosen. She has become queen. During this time, there are some things that happen, and it's interesting to see how it all takes place. But there's this guy named Haman, and he's like the viceroy. I mean, he's the right-hand man, and he's got a lot of power. And Mordecai, because he's very interested in what's happening with Esther, he just makes his home basically at the gate of the palace. And so he's there at the gate of the palace, and evidently there are others too. And Haman is a big feeling guy, evidently. I mean, when he comes and when he goes, he's expecting everybody to bow down to him. Mordecai is obviously a believer in God, and he's one that has the fortitude to do the kind of things that we would see that those who have come before them, such as the Daniels and those who wouldn't bow, those who wouldn't give in simply because a man was demanding that they would. And he wouldn't bow down to Haman, and it made Haman mad. And so when Haman actually found out who he was or what type of people he was, from Haman's perspective, he is now leading this charge that he wants all of the Jews, because of Mordecai, he wants all the Jews annihilated. Genocide. It's going to happen, and Haman is going to make it happen. He hates Mordecai because Mordecai is interrupting his power spree, or his aura, or whatever you might want to call it, that how he's feeling about himself. I mean, you can see it, you can read it, that he hates Mordecai just simply because Mordecai isn't bowing down. But he hates him so much, he wants to destroy all the Jewish people. He doesn't realize at this point that Esther is a Jew. He doesn't realize that Esther is the queen, is Mordecai's cousin, whom Mordecai has raised. He hasn't put all this together. He doesn't know that. He just knows this man's a Jew, and he's not bowing down to me. These people, they have got a history of doing things like that. We need to teach them a lesson. We're going to annihilate them. Nobody else is going to get away with this in this kingdom. This isn't the king. This is Haman. But he's a powerful man. In the meantime, Mordecai hears of this plot for the king to be overthrown, killed and overthrown. And so he reports the plot, and it gets to the king, and it's thwarted. And it's recorded in the journals of the king, and then that's it. Nothing else happens. Well, as Haman is making his plans and all this going on, he goes before the king, and he actually gets the king's stamp of approval on annihilating the Jews. The king he's the king. He's got other things to do. He hasn't bothered to see what nationality his wife is. He doesn't even think about the fact that she's a Jew. And so he stamped to annihilate this small group of people in the entire kingdom. Sure, if you've got a reason, it must be a good reason. You're my right-hand man. Stamp of approval. Go annihilate them. Set a date. Make it on the 13th of that month if you want to. So he does. Mordecai goes to Esther and he says, you've got to go before the king. Your life isn't going to be spared any more than our lives are going to be spared. We're all going to be killed. You've got to go before the king. Esther is scared to death. Esther says, but I could die because the king has not summoned me. Just because she was queen. She could go as quick as Vashti went. Just because she's queen, other people are going to have to cater to her. The king doesn't have to cater to her. She can just go before the king anytime she wants to. So she's scared. And this is the point that Mordecai says something. He says, how do you know but that you were born for such a time as this? That this is the very reason that you exist on this earth right now. That you're saving God's people. He doesn't say all of that, but how do you know that you weren't born for such a time as this? And so he tells her to fast, and he tells the rest of the people, the Jewish people, to fast. They fast for 3 days, and she goes into the king. When she goes in, his scepter moves, which means it's okay. Had he not responded that way, she very likely would have lost her life. It would have been over. But yet he does respond, and he listens to her that she wants to throw a banquet. That there's going to be some plans. She's going to reveal what's happening with all of this. In the meantime, the king that night can't sleep. It's very interesting how all of this just almost seems to just fall into place. The king can't sleep, and he's reading back over the annals of the king. He's looking back over the things that's been recorded and written down, things that maybe he doesn't even know has happened. And as a matter of fact, there's something that pops up that he didn't know took place. He's reading along, and, Mordecai. So they were going to kill me. And he told us about it, and they didn't kill me. Nothing was ever done for Mordecai. He was never honored for this. Why wasn't Mordecai ever honored for this? So he calls in his right-hand man, Haman. And here is Haman, who loathes Mordecai. And it's interesting the way the king does it. He brings him in, and he says, what should be done for the man that the king wants to honor? I kind of think at this point the king isn't even aware that this is the same guy that caused the whole destruction of the Jews to be in place. He just knows there's a man named Mordecai who has saved his life, and nothing has ever been done to honor this man. So calls in Haman. He says, what should be done for a man the king wants to honor? Well, of course, Haman knows it's got to be him, right? I mean, that's the ego this guy has. He's going to honor me, and he's going to ask me what I want. So you need to put a robe on him. You need to send him through the streets of the people in your chariot and proclaim to everybody as it's going on, this is what happens to the people that the king wants to honor. The man that the king thinks is great, this is what happens. So the king says, okay, that's a good idea. Dismisses Haman. This is what he plans for Mordecai. The banquet comes. Esther reveals to the king that there's a plot to kill all of her people, including her. King's furious at who would do such a thing like this, and of course she names Haman. I mean, it's really like the king is almost oblivious to everything, and of course I don't know everything that the king would have to do, or I don't know how much the king parties. I mean, we know that he did, but it's almost as if he's just given his stamp of approval to things that he hasn't really thought about that much. I mean, the annihilation of this group of people, like, that wouldn't be important. The king is upset. He leaves the chamber, and Haman is pleading with Esther, please, save my life, spare my life, please. And he goes over to her, and he's begging, and he's down, and the king walks back in. He thinks he's assaulting her. Now he's even more mad, and he says, this man's going to die. And they say, well, he's built a gallows 50 feet high for Mordecai, the man that you want to honor. And he says, hang him on it. So Haman dies. The king doesn't reverse his decree. It's been a decree of the king. He doesn't reverse his decree. That day is set that the people are now being paid to go out and kill Jews. But he says, but I issue another decree, now you can defend yourselves. So get ready for it. And they do. There are many that lose their lives over this because the Jews rise up against them. They're armed, they are ready. And there's 10 sons of Haman, and they all die. And they all, by even the request of Esther, then end up being hanged on the gallows as well. I guess in such a way for all the people to see, this is what happens to the man that the king doesn't honor. Interesting story, right? All of this happening to this completely unknown Jewish man and his cousin. And an entire nation of people are saved. Annihilation of the Jews, genocide of the Jewish people doesn't happen. It doesn't take place. Who's more powerful in this situation? Who's more than a king? I mean, Mordecai, after all this, Mordecai is raised up, and that's one of the reasons that the people, they just flee the Jews, because Mordecai has become all of a sudden so powerful, and people are scared to death of Mordecai. I mean, he has overthrown Haman. And look who he was. But they're now looking at Mordecai, who was a nobody, and he is now right-hand man. But in all actuality, more than a king. I mean, there are other situations, other stories that we can look at in Scripture, and it's amazing when you look at these. There's a king of Israel named Ahaziah. Ahaziah doesn't last very long, and actually he falls down, and it appears kind of like he's on the rooftop of the building, and where they would be able to look out among things in the palace, and they'd look out over the city and over the land, and it falls on him. It caves in, and so he is injured. And so he sends word, but get this, he sends word not to Elijah, who is the prophet, but he sends word to the prophets of Baal. He sends word to find out, am I going to survive? He's laying on a bed. He's hurt bad. Am I going to survive? And while the messenger is going to find out, is he going to survive or not, Elijah meets him and he tells him, because you sought out a pagan god. Why did you do that? Because you knew that there's not a God in Israel. Because the people, they had deserted God from the top on down. They'd walked away. To them, God did not exist in Israel anymore. And he says, because you have sought out another God, you will not get up from that bed. It's interesting, because the king sends back, and he sends a captain of 50, it says, and 50 of his men up to go talk to Elijah. And they come up and they say, you need to come with us. Ahaziah wants to see you. And he says, if I'm a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven and consume you and the 50 men that are with you. And it does. So Ahaziah sends another man over 50 and his 50 men, and they go up there and they say, you need to come and you need to talk to Ahaziah the king. And he says, if I am a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven and kill all of you. And it does. Ahaziah sends another man over 50 other men, and he takes those 50 men with him, and he comes up and he gets on his knees and he says, please consider my life precious in your sight, and the life of these 50 innocent men. I know that you have taken the lives of 2 others before us, 2 other groups of 50, plus the leaders. Please consider our lives precious in your sight. Ahaziah wants to talk with you. God speaks to Elijah and tells him, spare their life, go with them. And he does. And he comes to Ahaziah and he says, because, he says the same thing again, because you sought out another God, you will not get out of this bed. And he dies. When you look at Elijah, when you look at the things that happen around this man, what has already taken place with Ahaziah's parents, Ahab and Jezebel, everybody's heard of them, right? But you look at what God has done through this man. You talk about more than a king. There was no comparison. What God was doing through him. How more? Why? How does it all happen? I mean, not very much down the road after that, when Elisha, who had been a servant of Elijah, was now the prophet in Israel. With his servant with him, and thinking they were getting ready to get slaughtered, Elisha saying, God, open his eyes so that he can see. And when he does, they're surrounded by the angels of the Lord. More than kings. In Romans chapter 8, it doesn't say more than kings. And a lot of you know exactly what it says. But I want us to turn over there. And we read it a couple of weeks ago. We were looking in Romans. And after he's asking the question, who shall separate us in verse 35 from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, hardship, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, or sword? What is going to separate us from Christ loving us? He answers this in verse 37, no, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. I mean, we're looking at more than just being surrounded, looking at the mountains and seeing the chariots and the angels of God surrounding us. We're looking at the love of Jesus that would take his own life, sacrifice it for us. Not just a physical life, but a spiritual life that was spotless, that was clean, that he would take our filthiness upon himself. To take it to the cross. To take it to death. To crucify it, to leave it there. That he would take that. So we have more than even what they had. Were they not more than kings? And look what he has made us, more than conquerors. There is absolutely nothing that can separate us from the love of Christ. In 1 John chapter 5, if you guys want to come on up, you can. He says in verse 1, everyone who believes that Jesus is Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome. And then he says in verse 4, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. Excuse me. Let me read that again. Everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God.